Okay, in this video, we're going to look how we do psychological research methods. Like, how do we actually research and what methods do we use to make sure that the information and the data we collect is accurate, that the experiment works out correctly, and that we get accurate data, especially as we know in psychology that as human beings, probably the biggest problem with psychology and science is not the science doesn't work, not the psychology doesn't work, but human beings make mistakes. We are fallible, we make mistakes, and we have bias. So let's look at how you do this. So, how do psychologists conduct valid experiments? Well, we're actually going to learn from our flawed experiment, and probably one of the most famously flawed experiments is the Hawthorne effect. Now, the Hawthorne effect in 1924 went to about 1933, and within this 9 years, they did research on the Hawthorne industrial complex. And basically, what the psychologists were trying to find out was how can they increase productivity at a factory with factory workers? Well, at first, they turned the lights up and see if better lighting worked. It did. Then they dimmed the lights. Well, that did as well. And then they had windows in one room. They did all these different things. And what they found out was the productivity was always increasing. So something was going on. The question was, what was going on? Well, what was going on is we call it the Hawthorne effect. It's the tendency of research subjects to change their behavior as a result of being observed. Guess what? When somebody's watching you, you may act different. In fact, you see this in the classroom. When I walk around the room, I notice, and we're even taught as teachers, that we get close proximity with the student. That's the best intervention right there to help them focus. And it works. A lot of the times, most of the time, it works. Maybe if the kid's not asleep, it's not going to work. But if I walk up towards you or somebody and they're playing on their computer or something or not focused and they see me watching them, they notice and they start to focus. Now, what has this probably contributed to? Well, the dominant theory is probably evolutionary psychology, that our ancestors that were aware that predators or other animals were watching them, those ancestors were more likely to pass on their traits. And they were more likely to live because they would run away when the bear or the tiger or the lion tried to eat them. Whereas our ancestors that did not pay attention to their environment and were not aware somebody was watching them or an animal was watching them or even other hunter-gatherers, they probably got hurt or even died and they didn't pass their genes on. So remember, we have a lot of our brain works just like our ancestors as hunter-gatherers a couple 100,000 years ago. Our brains haven't evolved that much, but they have evolved. So let's watch what happened during the Hawthorne effect.
The Hawthorne effect is the tendency we have to perform better when we know somebody is studying us. For example, a 2015 study of hospital staff hand washing found that staff were almost 3 times more likely to wash their hands when they knew they were being studied. The term Hawthorne effect comes from an experiment conducted at a US factory run by General Electric in Hawthorne near Chicago during the 1920s into factors that affected productivity. Everything worked. Increasing the illumination of the factory boosted productivity. Dimming the lights boosted productivity. Introducing rest pauses also worked. So did small group incentives. Oddly, after a positive change, returning to previous work conditions was also met with positive results. One popular interpretation of these results is that the novelty of being observed leads humans to perform tasks better. When we feel we're being studied, we improve our behaviour. While the experiment has been described as a glorified anecdote and it certainly falls well short of modern social science, it gives rise to this famous Hawthorne effect. Modern studies have confirmed the presence of this effect in a range of scenarios. For example, when teachers are observed in classrooms, they can exhibit better teaching behaviours than when left to their own devices. In my own work, I've had participants literally say, "I was going to do A, but I knew you were coming in, so I did B." While this can be a cause of frustration for researchers, it has implications for teachers. When students know they're being studied and valued, their performance improves. It also means that professional practice projects in schools, whatever they may be, will usually result in improved teaching outcomes. So, get into teams, observe each other, it'll almost certainly work. When humans know they're being studied, their performance usually improves. That is the Hawthorne effect.
So, what are some possible flaws? And I want you to think about this study have, and how did these flaws affect the study's outcome? Okay, so we're gonna look at that. So, how do psychologists conduct valid experiments? Well, we do the opposite of the Hawthorne effect. So, some of the problems in the Hawthorne effect, and this is why we don't do this, is A, there was room for researchers' self-serving bias. Self-serving bias means that, hey, if I got an idea, if we turn the lights on and everybody goes up, the productivity goes up. See, lights turn the productivity up. Or, hey, I got an idea, if we have more windows, productivity goes up. What they weren't calculating, because they wanted the study to work, they wanted the lights going up to increase productivity because it was their idea. And they wanted to be the one that benefits from a good theory or question or hypothesis, was that they were changing the behavior, and they didn't factor that in. They did not have a control group. There was no control group. They were just watching people that they turned the lights on. They would have to have people, similar group of people in the factory or another factory, same amount of people, same demographics, hopefully, and they would have to not turn the lights on and see how the productivity went. How did the people do without the lights going up in other places? But then you'd have to look at other variables, like there more windows? Was there better circulation? But the thing that was really changing it was the fact that there are people actually watching them. Now, same size sample, or the sample sizes were way too small. They did one factor and they looked at small groups of people, even though it was over 9 years, that's not enough. You need a bigger sample, depending on what you're looking at. Surveys, we know you need at least a couple thousand participants. Also, you have to make sure you're sampling people all across America. What demographics are you targeting? Are you targeting white Americans? Are you targeting African Americans? Are you looking at males? Are you looking at females? Age is important. Are you looking at teenagers? Are you looking at elderly people? Are you looking at mid-age people? Are you looking at children? Those are all big factors that when we do a study. And the result of this study may have been is misinterpreted. So they start misinterpreting the information as, oh wow, your better lighting increases productivity. Oh wow, wait, that doesn't make any sense because dim lighting increases productivity. No, it's not the lighting. You're misinterpreting it. You're forgetting that the constant variable is you, that these psychologists were watching people work at a factory. And just because they knew people are watching them, they increase productivity probably because they don't want to lose their jobs. And also they're aware people are watching you, tend to pay attention more to what you're doing. Now, how do we conduct a scientific experiment? Well, we watched a video on the University of Chicago's experiment at the Chicago Heights High School. And what they did a pretty scientific experiment, is first of all, they followed the 5 basic steps that you have to follow in a scientific research. The first thing they did was they formed a research question. So their question was, if you remember in the film, was, hey, if we throw money at students, if we give them money as a positive incentive, will they change their behavior, specifically in a way that we can measure, all right? So then they formed a hypothesis. Well, their hypothesis was, yes, if we give students $50 a month just to maintain a C average, they have to have all their grades above a C, they will get $50, and at that time was $50 a month. Then they'll get entered into a drawing, and they can win $500. Then they're going to enter into another drawing where they get a car ride and a limousine. They can take their friends out on town for a night. That sounds amazing, right? If we do all these incentives and we track this and stay on top of this, we are going to have something like 30% growth. We should probably get maybe 3 out of 10 kids' grades up. And that's a big job. That's a big impact. So, and these were economists doing it instead of psychologists. Now, what they found out by testing their hypothesis and collecting the data, and what was the metrics, which are the measurable data points, and the metrics in this case were grades. Grades are measurable. They used the same grading system in Chicago Heights. We use 90% as an A here. That's not the case in all high schools. I went to high schools, 93% or above was an A. and we had A minuses. But you use their grading system, and they didn't have F's in this experiment. They only have E's. They give E's for underperforming. Now, analyzing the results. So they analyzed the results, and in the end, what did they find by collecting and looking at the data? Actually, the end results showed that they only had about a 5 to 7% increase. After spending something like, I think, $500,000 on this experiment to get these high school students to increase their grades, only about 5 to 7% of the grades went up with $50 more. They found out the A kids probably performed about the same. B kids, probably around the B's. C's, too. They got some movement in D's and maybe a little in the F's, but they only got about 5 to 7%. And I question if that's even accurate, because they probably had a margin of error of 2%. So it could have been as low as 3% change, or it could have been as high as a 9%. But some of the conclusions they drew were very important. So their experiment failed in the sense it didn't meet their hypothesis. However, we can learn from failed experiments, and their conclusion was in the failed experiment that A, maybe we're using money and incentives too late in life. High school might be too late. Well, I disagree. Obviously, as a high school teacher, I think it's never too late. But I do understand that the amount of growth I can have as a high school teacher with you guys is not going to be as much as an elementary school teacher. And that's exactly what they did. They went into preschool and elementary, and this research has been done over and over again in some shape or form. And what we found is where you get your biggest bang for your buck, believe it or not, in education is preschool. We find that if we invest in free preschool, or kids that have preschool are 20% less likely to go to jail, less likely to be incarcerated. Also, if you go to preschool, that just increases the probability you'll graduate college by 20%. Now, there's a lot of other variables in there. First of all, whose parents can afford to send them to preschool, and so forth and so on, and how could that be impacting their life? And if your parents are invested in preschool, could that be having an impact there? But also, it presents a pretty strong argument, and President Obama used to argue this, we should have free national preschool, and we don't. While we have free preschool in certain school districts like Ferguson, Florissant, even my own neighbor, we don't have free preschool. It costs us. We get reduced tuition, but it's about over $10,000 a year to send my son to preschool, and we did. It's very expensive. So what would happen nationwide if we gave free preschool? And the answer is there would definitely be giant gains for all of society. States like Illinois and Oklahoma, believe it or not, have actually invested in free preschool for their kids, and they are going to see benefits. Unfortunately, they're not going to see those benefits until probably after college. So they've only had free preschool for so long in Oklahoma. We'll see how it goes. Now, the last thing is you must have a consensus and reproducible results. Above all, can this experiment be done again with a similar demographic and have the same results? The answer is no, then it's a flawed experiment. Hawthorne experiment could not be redone. It didn't work. It's a mess. They had too small samples. So what you need to do is make sure you have a huge sample, which can be very hard with something like a high school. Even though in Chicago they had 4,000 people in this high school, that's one big high school, but are Chicago high school students thinking and acting the same as the rest of the country? Were they demographically diverse? Were there about the same amount of boys and girls? Those are questions we have to look at. So then we're looking at in the picture, you can see there's case studies, statistics, literature reviews, interviews, focus groups. We're going to talk a little bit about all these ways that we can research humans. So how to create a valid experiment? Well, first of all, we have to understand what are the variables, anything and everything that affects the experiment. Well, in the case of the education and bringing the kids' grades up, their parents are probably the biggest variable, right? Their parents were a big variable. If their parents are pushing them, or their parents are getting involved, are excited about this experiment with the kid, that's more likely to get the grades up. So we did kind of a case study. We watched one boy and the mom was doing homework with the kid every night. And she said, look, I didn't graduate high school. I don't want that to ever happen to my son. That's not going to happen. She kept pushing her son and had high expectations. That is a very big variable. That is something but that variable is actually a constant variable. It's constant in the sense that it's a variable that the environment factors do not change. So the mother doesn't change. Your mom is not going to change. Your dad's not going to change. The teachers are constants. And these are things that can affect they're variables that can affect the participant. So a constant would be the teacher. The school is a good constant. The location is a good constant. We might have some kids move, they're going to be cut out of the experiment. And some things, kids get displaced. They lose their homes or their condos or their apartments and they have to move. That could affect the constant of where you live. So, now, independent variables are where variations does not depend on or another. So things that are independent of the variable. So things that don't affect the the variations that don't impact another. So some independent variables in the experiment with the teenagers and the students could be seen as the school, again, is independent. Where they live, the classrooms and their schedules. Dependent variables would be valid depending on the independent variable, giving you data. So what was the big dependent variable? It was their grades. Their grades were dependent on all these factors. But the independent variable that we're going to put in there to give us the data, in this case, was in fact money. So the independent variable that we're going to put in there is we're going to add money into the situation. If we give students $50 a month and they can win $500 and a limousine ride, will they change their behavior and do better on their grades than if they didn't have those things? And the answer was not really, just a little bit, about 5 to 7% growth. That's not much for $500,000. So that raises questions on how effective is money. This also attacks behaviorism like we've talked about in the past. Is behaviorism the way to get people to shape their behavior? Or what's more important, and a lot of businesses and companies and schools have changed to go to social cognitive theory, where modeling behavior, coaches, teachers, showing the right behavior, having positive students in your school that model good behavior, that's going to be much more effective than probably giving people $50. Advisory, mentoring systems, they work much better. Now, how do we conduct? First of all, I looked at tested the hypothesis, a well-designed experiment. They had a pretty well-designed experiment from the University of Chicago. They're experts. Even though it failed or didn't do what their hypothesis thought, it was still, they got important data. Analyze the results. Well, they did that. There was patterns and relationships between the data. And the relationships they found is the money did not have a very strong relationship with the grade. Now, other conclusions, what did they observe? Well, they found out teenagers don't respond to money as much as teenagers would tell you. When we survey teenagers, you guys say, would you rather have money or time? Most people say money. When we ask adults, they say time. It did not support the hypothesis. No, the money did not. Even though teenagers say that, they perceive it. Unfortunately, the money itself does not probably motivate them as much as many other things like parents, coaches, teachers, classrooms, all the other variables. Psychologists have to keep open minds. They have to be willing to adjust to modify the hypothesis. Well, did the economists do that in the experiment? They did. They said, it didn't work. That's not the end of the world. Let's go ahead and see what happens if we have more incentives with elementary kids or preschool kids. And that's what led to other studies that taught us that, yes, elementary and preschool kids respond much better than incentives. But also social learning, again, is still probably much more effective than prizes and rewards and punishments, which tells us at home what we model to our son, our daughter, and when you guys are parents, is probably much more important than if you buy them things. Now, the biggest question of whether at the end can the experiment be replicated, and we could see that yes, in the end, it actually could be proven that this experiment actually was flawed, and then they could try this with other groups and have different results. And again, remember, causation with correlation is hey, in the summer, did you know ice cream sales are up when sunburns happen? Yeah. Well, guess what? That is a correlation. I don't want to eat more ice cream because I have a sunburn, and I don't get sunburned because I eat more ice cream. Those are correlation, which means a connection. Now, dry, hot summers, that was the cause of eating more ice cream. That was the cause of more people being sunburned. Just like on the other side, in the picture, you can see shark bite attacks go up when ice cream sales go up. Did you know that? Well, that's a correlation, but it's not an actual correlation that has any connection at all. They're connected because they happen at the same time of year, but guess what? Higher temperatures cause people to go more swimming in the ocean. They're more likely to get bit by a shark. People eat more ice cream when it's hot out or the temperature rises. They're more likely to buy ice cream. So it's not the shark bites that make me want to buy ice cream. It's not the ice cream sales that make me want to go swimming and get bit by a shark. It's the higher temperatures. That's when this all happens.